and India. I'm delighted you're here. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to pose a number of questions to Ram. It's going to be a loosely structured conversation, and then leave time for questions from all of you as well to him. Okay, so my questions are coming from all over the place, but Ram has willingly agreed to take all of them. So the first question is on the importance of innovation, and I wanted to start with a quote from Obama. And the quote is, "The first step in winning the future is encouraging American innovation. What we can do, what America does better than anyone else, is spark the creativity and imagination of our people. To win the future, the US must out-innovate the rest of the world." And my question was that if this is a flat world for ideas, and ideas can come from anywhere, is Obama right or wrong? Does the US have to be out-innovating everybody, or can it just get ideas from people in India and China and from anywhere else at all? What are your opinions on this?
So first of all, I don't think anybody could legislate innovation or will it to just happen. Innovation is sort of a state of mind. And the reason it succeeds in a place like Silicon Valley is it's a culture of risk-taking. It's a culture of where failure is not a failure forever. You can fail once or twice. If you fail 7 times, then you better go work for Oracle or Hewlett-Packard or somebody. But if you fail once or twice, it's really a badge of honor in a way. And so I think innovation in the sense of what does the government do to help innovation, I think really get out of the way is the first thing I would say, but which frankly in California, in spite of high taxes, high cost of living, the reason it's been possible to have this level of success is universities like Stanford, where a lot of research institutions have been a source of a lot of the innovation that have become commercial products or commercial ventures that turn into big companies. Going back to the birth of Hewlett-Packard from here, and then of course later on many companies, Yahoo, and the more prominent ones from today, Google in particular. But I think with respect to India and innovation, I would say the place where, if I was the government, I would put the most emphasis is on more institutions of higher learning and more emphasis on primary research. Because if you graduate from one of the IITs today, you're immediately given a job at either, well, back in the day, it used to be in one of the outsourcing companies. Today, most of the foreign multinationals who are in Bangalore or who are in Delhi or in other places in India hire them right away at high wages, or they come and recruit from the United States and then bring them back here. And we don't need to talk about immigration reform as an issue, but they find a way to get the best students to come here if they have to. So that is the level of international competition for recruiting top talent. So in that environment, for you to have innovation hubs within the country, the best place to start is more educational institutions with high meritocracy, which really means there's a shortage of teaching talent in India, so that's where they need to focus, and to let private enterprise in to invest in education, because that's not necessarily a bad thing, just that it needs to be monitored so the profit objective doesn't take over and that they don't somehow end up not doing a good job because they're only focused on profits. Because there's lots of nefarious educational institutions in India that are just focused on profit and on nothing else. So I would say that's one. The other I would focus on is the development of the internet. So much of the education can now happen online, so in a flat world of knowledge where somebody that really wants to learn something, learn the programming, the CS 106 class that's taught here and is getting more and more popular with the undergrads at Stanford, if that is now, it's now possible for somebody that's in an Indian institution in a Bachelor of Commerce degree or someone who's interested in programming can learn it online. The problem is access to the internet. There's not enough access that's broadly available, so they don't have access to all the content. But the content is now freely available, and it's taught by some of the best teachers, and it's available around the world. I just came from a meeting with John Mitchell, who runs the online effort here at Stanford. He said the courses so far, they've had over 500,000 students watch to completion the videos that they put up online in the 1 year since the birth of the online effort at Stanford. So, and I didn't ask him the question of how many of those were from India, but I would guess very large number come from India, not so much from China, because India has the advantage of language, because everything is taught in English, it's not translated into a local language in a foreign country. So Indians will learn if they're given the opportunity, and I think we're undereducating and underperforming on the education front in India. So I would take a lot of the money and put it there. For example, recently, I heard about $2.5 billion that the Indian government wants to put towards creating a fab that they're going to promote in India. Well, I would take that money and put it in education instead. Because I think we've lost that battle with respect to fabs and trying to put the supply chain for hardware in India. That battle was fought 20 years ago. We lost it to China, and now I think we've lost it to Vietnam. So better focus on education and go after the human capital talent that exists in India.
I'm actually going to come back to education later on, but I'm going to ask you a simple follow-up question to my first question, and that is, of all the ideas that you entertain, and I'm sure you must be getting a ton of ideas every day in your email from somebody saying, what do you think of this? How many of those ideas originate? I mean, I'm guessing the majority do come from the US, but do they come from all over the world? Do you see it? Is it a flat world of ideas, and do they come from everywhere?
It is a flat world of ideas, but what really makes the difference ultimately is the execution of the ideas. The idea is not worth a lot by itself. The idea in the sense of primary research is worth a lot, but even the professor that gets spun out of, say, Stanford or one of these great institutions that goes off to start a company, not everyone succeeds, because the difference between the ideation phase and the execution phase is important because that's what leads to commercial success. Lots of companies fail in that execution phase. There's a huge chasm there. You know, it's like they fall into that and they don't come back up. And that's why the success rate in startups is low. Of course, in India, you face the additional barrier that there are lots of issues beyond the traditional issues we face here for a startup to succeed that they have to face in India. And some of those, again, go back to shortage of skilled talent in the newer industries.
Okay, so following up on that idea, one of the big buzzwords in India right now is reverse globalization. And this is the idea of firms that start in India with ideas that originate from India and start off in the Indian market, but then move to Asian markets, European markets, and the US market. And you funded two of the major examples of reverse globalization in India, that's InMobi and Paymate. Tell us about this. Is this a trend that other companies in India can follow? Was this unique to these two firms? Do you see more of this happening globally? And in Silicon Valley itself, do you see Paymate has opened up in Sunnyvale, I believe. InMobi is here as well.
Well, InMobi is quite big now. But so basically, I should say, frankly, I didn't really think reverse globalization when I was funding these companies. And in the case of InMobi, the premise was that we were going to create a company that would sell to the Indian consumer. And this is an ad company. It's a mobile ad network company. The problem is the mobile ad market in India is very small. I would say the entire online ad market in India is about $500 million, of which the mobile ad business may be $80 million. So it's a small market. That's the total market. And that market is largely consumed by Google and by Facebook and a few others. So it's not very large, and it's not large because of a number of factors. Because everybody cites, well, there's more, more than 500 million cell phones in India. Well, how many of those are 3G phones? How many of those have data plans on them? So the problem with market size is it's not a market that's an available market for online data applications yet. I think in time to come it will, and there again, public policy can play a useful role. But let me stick with the theme of InMobi. So what we then decided to do is we had to go look east and look west. So we first went into Malaysia, into Singapore. Singapore, of course, is a very small market. Malaysia, a little bit bigger market. Indonesia, Philippines. And these countries have consumers who are using data rate plans on their 3G phones. So we were able to immediately have a much bigger ad opportunity, despite the fact that India should have been a much bigger opportunity for scale. So we were successful there. Then we went into Africa, into Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria in particular, those 3 countries, and reasonably successful there. And then Korea, Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand. So this is a company much like, say, Skype started in, say, Scandinavia and then became a global phenomena. InMobi started in India but really succeeded in the rest of Asia and has succeeded in Africa and now is quite successful in Europe, but hasn't yet come to the US in any sort of serious way, because it's very expensive to come to the US, so they said, let's succeed elsewhere. So today it's a $200 million company, 800 employees, but it's an example of an Indian success still, because a majority of the employees are in Bangalore, and the next largest number of employees is here in San Francisco, where they have 100 people, and then they have 60 employees in London. Many of whom were from a company they bought in Cambridge, and then they moved them where they had a London office. So you can tell that, for you to be a successful international internet company, you have to be global from day one. And but it helps to have scale in the domestic market where you start, and that's what hurts most Indian startups. There's not enough scale possible in the domestic market. Paymate's a little different story. I think it was the idea that you could do person-to-person transfers using mobile from the city to the village. So you had the Bihari chef or the Kerala driver. I'm not picking on any region of India, so this is not I'm just saying it because it's kind of more typical of what I see in Bombay, for example. And their families live in the village. There is no banking in the village, so for the unbanked sector, they were able to transfer money from cell phone to cell phone and have them go pick up the money at the local PCO, which is where they went to make a long-distance phone call before, but now they go there to pick up their money. And so the bank, instead of opening a branch in that city, ends up paying them commission to the PCO, because the PCO already exists in that city. And so this is generally not a second-tier city, but a third-tier city in country. So that succeeded. So Mexico said, well, this is a model we could adopt. And so we licensed the software to a bank in Mexico. And so that's kind of how that developed. And then pretty soon, there are a few people in the US said, well, why don't we use this instead of Western Union as a way to send money from immigrant populations in country back to their home countries?
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that point, because I think the tendency in India is we hear a success story like that, and then we say to everybody, well, look, InMobi succeeded, so it's not that bad to do business in India. One of the big criticisms of doing business in India is that firms come in there because they come in there for the market size. And once they get in there, they realize that even though India has a population of 1.2 billion, et cetera, the market size is actually quite small because of the factors you've mentioned, lack of smartphones, lack of internet, lack of wireless, et cetera. Do you think that firms like this show that market size need not be a constraining factor in India, or is it very much the constraining factor?
Unfortunately, Anjani, it is very much a constraining factor, and it's unfortunately sad because the talent exists. The Indian population is very entrepreneurial, and they're very keen to build new businesses, but the internet the combination of lack of cheap broadband availability and the lack of, I would say, to some degree, electricity, because the internet follows wherever there's electricity. So, we can look at a global map and you could see where the internet penetration has taken off is wherever there's reliable, at least 20 hours of electricity a day, reliably. I think the cheap broadband issue is something that I think India is starting to tackle, but it needs to be tackled on the data side, and it needs to be tackled in the last mile, which is from where the fiber ends to where the delivery at the retail level happens. And that's where you need broadband, because you can't today do reliably YouTube or Google Maps for any length of time in India. Right. It doesn't work well. And I think that needs to be fixed for there to be a local market of new entrepreneurs developing to the cell phone as the platform. The mobile phone is the new computer, and to the extent that it could be developed to that platform, you need much faster access times and more reliable electricity. So those are two simple things to ask for. So I would say for those that are involved in public policy in the room, if the government could focus on those two things, I think it would be great.
Leads nicely into my next question, which is again on innovation and the factors behind it. So everybody here in Silicon Valley says, innovation is the key to everything. And all the economists, well, not all the economists disagree, but most of the economists say it's all institutions, and institutions are the key to everything. So if you get institutions right, innovation will follow, and everything else will follow from that. So this is a question on institutions. Silicon Valley got it right. What are the essential things that happen in Silicon Valley to make it such a success in the technology world? And if we can identify those factors, if you can tell me, here are the 6 things we had, why is it not possible for it to be replicated in other places, particularly in countries that are willing to put aside like a special economic zone in which they will allow an innovation hub to develop? That's been very difficult to replicate Silicon Valley. So your opinions first on what is underlying the success of Silicon Valley, and then if we know what it is, why has it been so hard to replicate?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think Silicon Valley, as I said at the beginning, is more a state of mind rather than just a place. And it's a very hard thing to replicate, although I think New York is having some success, London is having some success, and more recently Stockholm is having success with a whole bunch of new startups that are likely to become bigger companies. But I think the reasons why Silicon Valley was successful was a great set of higher education institutions, a willingness of the entrepreneurs to take risks based on the fact that there was availability of capital without onerous requirements around the capital. In other words, they were able to keep a good part of the upside for themselves as entrepreneurs. So even between here and New York, for example, dealing with realtors for office space for a company that I start here versus a company in New York, I see a big difference. The New York realtor says, "Oh, you're a startup. Give me 15 months of rent up front." Well, I'm writing the check for this young company to start up. I mean, this actually, I was talking to somebody from Harvard a little while ago. Paperless Post, a company that I funded in New York, actually faced this issue because they had to write a check from my check. They were taking a good portion of it and giving it to a landlord in New York. And I said, "That's not what I gave it to you for. I want you to go hire engineers for this money." So that's, so it's a mindset. So I think that is changing, and to the extent that's happening, these issues go away. And to that, I would say that Bangalore is having reasonable success, but the infrastructure, and if I may be kind, is very challenged.
That's very kind.
Yeah, and electricity is a big issue. I mean, you cannot say you're the Silicon Valley of India and not have electricity. The internet is challenged. So these issues have to be solved, and have to be solved in a reasonable time frame. And I would say those were sort of the early reasons for success. And then came the ecosystem. The ecosystem is really about having the venture debt people here who are willing to lend money based on the fact that, yes, so the venture debt model is very simple. It works on the fact that they're going to charge high interest rates. So they're charging 10 to 12% interest rates. They take a small ownership of the company in the form of warrants, typically 0.5% of the company at the early stage. And then they expect their money to be returned in 3 years. There's lots of people here that you can go get that money from without having a receivable on your books. Now, how many people in the world will be willing to to do that, right? So that exists in Silicon Valley. The lawyers exist who are willing to write these things up very quickly, very cleanly, very simple. So there's only 3 kinds of term sheets that today get written up. They're all very simple flavors. And then there's a whole sort of
That's the first time anybody has praised lawyers in my presence.
Well, the lawyers that are in the tech startup world do a good job, by and large.
That excludes you, Gerhard.
So, and then you've got the whole incubator world of people like Y Combinator. You know, God bless Y Combinator, because yes, the guy lends you his expertise for 3 months, but those 3 months, the multiplier effect on bad decisions are so huge. If they made bad decisions in those early 3 months, that would probably be fatal to that startup. So the fact that they have somebody who's built many companies before advising them and doing it is what the incubator does really well. And so, and then of course you've got a lot of people who are not so good who try to do the same thing. And so you could pick and choose from the best to the not so good. And so there's a whole range of services that are offered in the middle that are helpful for the young entrepreneur. But the whole notion of mentorship is very valuable, and that doesn't exist. And then middle management, the engineers, the whole process needs to be there. But frankly, today, if I was to advise a startup, I'd say don't start in Silicon Valley.
Really?
Go to Stockholm or go to New York, go somewhere else, because there's a shortage of engineers, and everybody here wants to have their own company rather than work for somebody else. So it's really hard to get people to come work for you. So that's, the system has gotten to the point where it's almost too hard to build a company here.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize you, but I have to, being from India, I have to ask the question, which I think is fundamental importance to India. India, everything is, if you talk about growth, you have to talk about poverty. So you can't get away without talking about poverty. And when the government talks about technology, they talk about technology as a means of reducing poverty,
right,
as much as they talk about technology as something that causes growth. So India's made that sort of a hallmark. We're going to use technology to reduce poverty. And they want to do it through education, but they also want to do it through the UID scheme. I know that you are involved in a number of NGOs that work on education issues in India and in the US. Talk to us about technology and poverty. Do you see, in India, do you see that it can really make a difference? And what would be required to make a difference? Schemes like UID or anything else that you'd...
So Nandan was here recently, and I spent some time with him. In fact, he came over and we talked about a whole range of issues. And I think Aadhaar is doing a great job. I think UID has been a success because it essentially eliminates a whole bunch of people in the process of delivery of whether it's money or food stamps or whatever, all of which are opportunities for corruption. So to the extent that you automate that process. So one of the things that the government can do is have an open data policy, for example, where if you could in real time, whether it's land registration or licensing or anything else, put it online immediately in real time, that level of transparency would immediately improve governance. And that's something they can do, but they need to have the will to do it. And so that's one example of a valuable thing to do. Another thing that I've been thinking about is this whole area of spectrum policy. So one of the things that India suffers from is there is a lot of spectrum. Spectrum is a reusable natural resource. It's a wonderful thing that you're able to have spectrum that could be used for multiple purposes. So why not have multi-use spectrum? So the military controls a lot of bands that they're not using. So could it be regulated in a way in which it's available for commercial use, except in an emergency it gets commandeered? Another example is this whole model of auctioning, which of course has been the source of a huge amount of corruption in India for spectrum, and also caused a lot of these telecom companies to not be able to invest in the infrastructure to actually build out, because they've spent all their money on the auction or paying off, for whatever reason. Could it be where the new model is share of revenue? In other words, we're going to allocate spectrum based on share of revenue based on build-out. Mm-hmm. So you make the build-out happen faster, and the share of revenue you pay us is lower. So more people are served by it, and maybe you have a governor on speeds. If you're able to deliver in a certain region of the country at these speeds, we would collect a lower fee than if you were delivering at a much lower speed. So if you deliver broadband at a higher speed wirelessly, We will take less as the government. So I think those things are valuable new ideas that the government needs to look into.
Yeah.
Someone needs to run the economic models on these things. Yes, I understand that it potentially means a loss of $70 billion or whatever to the exchequer based on the collection of these auction model spectrum fees. But this is a better alternative if you can ultimately improve the GDP based on more internet access, which has been proven in China. So, and in India, everybody cites China as the example. Well, if you truly want to follow China, then why not improve the GDP by making the internet accessible at some reasonably usable speed for at least 300 million citizens?
It fits in great into the topic of our conference because it sounds like an area where we could have a lot of interstate competition and have one state competing against the other in terms of those kind of arrangements.
Exactly. So I would urge you to push this theme forward as the election manifestos of the parties come to the fore before the elections.
We'll follow up on that. But let me turn it over to the audience and any questions that Ram can address. NK.
Thanks, Ram. That was quite a nice overview of the many challenges and many opportunities that in India we have. Having dealt with the earlier phase of the telecom before I joined politics, when I was in the Ministry of Finance, one of the areas which has struck me in terms of a faster rollout for the broadband connectivity in rural area, quite apart from this issue of energy, which you have no doubt mentioned, there is a huge unutilized corpus of funds called the Universal Service Obligation Fund, which is based on the fee that was levied to every licensee. Now, unfortunately, the utilization of that has been exceedingly poor. So on the one hand, you have a huge accumulated large reserves, which is doing nothing. On the other hand, you have a dramatically slow rollout of rural telephony and broadband connectivity. Do you have any creative ideas on how this can be very competitively but transparently used for fostering a much faster rollout?
Right. So I'm guessing the universal service fee was levied largely to make sure that the urban consumer pays for access for phone service in rural areas. Is that
partly, but also partly telephone users in a certain sense, because it comes out of the license fee, which the government levies. So it's a portion of his license fee which goes towards, which doesn't go directly to the Consolidated Fund of India, but one part of it goes towards the Universal Service Obligation Fund.
So I think, without knowing the specific issues related to this corpus that's been created, I would say that there is a digital divide even in the cities, let alone in rural India. And I do think it's important to have a focus in the rural areas, but for access. And certainly if fiber reaches the villages, then getting from that fiber head end or drop to a wireless coverage in a rural area is fairly straightforward. If you build a mesh network, you can do that, as long as you have power, electricity, that is. But in urban India, I think there's a huge digital divide where a large amount of the population lives and goes to college or learns and wants to seek work, etc. And to the extent that some of that money could be used to improve access even in the second and third tier cities before going to rural. Because the challenge in rural is for every new person who gets access, the cost you spend to get that access is much higher than, say, in the second and third tier city, where that access will give you a greater return on capital. So if you think about it from a pure return on capital, return on equity kind of basis, I would say go spend it in second and third tier cities, in Indore and Chandigarh and I don't know, I can't think of all the, Coimbatore and Koilon and wherever else, before you spend it in really rural India. To the extent that the laws allow you to take that money and spend it. But I would spend it rather than have it just sit there, because I think there's a greater return on spending it.
Anne?
Thank you. That's fascinating, and appreciate your time and willingness to be here. I've got sort of a puzzle, because obviously there are a lot of Indians who have not the educational attainments or what have you, at the moment at least, to enter into high-tech software development, this kind of stuff. And the history of other countries at that stage is that there's been a lot of more unskilled labor-intensive development in manufacturing and so on. And I think most of us here would agree that things like labor laws have to be changed and stuff.
Right.
But if you ask them, what are the priorities within India? At this stage of development, with India still a relatively poor country, how much of that should be in the let's develop Silicon Valley high tech, which obviously there are a huge number of
Right.
people who are capable of, and there are let's see, 3 million people already in those, but there are also 300 million who can't do
Right.
it. And I worry a little bit about talking too much about innovation for fear of saying, okay, we'll look at those and not the rest of
Right.
society. And I wonder how you react to that.
I couldn't agree with you more. However, and India cannot solve its problem of employment needs for these millions of young people without having a strong manufacturing base. However, in order to have manufacturing, they need to, and they have had success in areas like autos, for example. The auto manufacturing sector has done really well. I think there are other success stories in manufacturing where India has made very good strides, but in order to have a much bigger manufacturing base, there is a whole set of infrastructure issues that need to be first addressed. Everything from roads, ports, the electricity issue again, and all of those sorts of things. And that's should be on a parallel track to this discussion. The trickle-down effect on the 3 million jobs that were created in outsourcing allowed for another 20 million people to be employed because they were higher-paying jobs. The problem is the whole outsourcing business, which created 4 companies of $20 billion market cap, has run its course. You know, it's sort of a technology business. All technology businesses have a half-life, if they're lucky, of 20 years. So that has run its course. So there needs to be new businesses on that front, or else they'll even lose those 3 million jobs. And so they need to be thinking about that separate from how do we create 50 million manufacturing jobs, because without that, you can't solve the problem for those 300 million people. So you're absolutely right. That's a bigger issue than this innovation issue, and that issue is tied to infrastructure, core infrastructure issues. But for India to become a manufacturing export-oriented country, they need to have ports that can actually, and roads that can actually take the goods to the port and then get it out from there. And that needs to be solved at the infrastructure level.
I think we'll take 2 more questions before we close, if that's okay.
Sure.
Krishna, and then there's a question at the end.
Thank you.
At the end.
In the beginning, you mentioned about innovation and institutions of high learning. When I look at India, I'm a professor here at Stanford, and when I compare myself to my counterparts in IITs and their ability to make money, and what their students with a bachelor's degree make money, which is about 4 to 5 times their professor does, what is the incentive of a person with a PhD in engineering to start teaching? And if that's the case, what advice do you have for some of the government people who are here?
That's a very good question.
When I compare this to countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, China, they reward the best performing teachers very handsomely.
Right. Very, very good point. And I did reference it earlier when I said I think the biggest challenge in scaling up higher education in India will be teaching talent. So I think there's only one simple answer, which is what Singapore has done, which is what Sweden has done. I think China is recruiting heavily from the US back to China from a lot of the Ivies. which is to pay a lot more. And there is no other solution to it other than to pay much higher wages. So to the extent that the investment that's going in higher education is not going just to go procure the land in, I just saw the announcement of IIT Hyderabad with a $200 million investment from the Japanese government. It was wonderful to see that. And I hope that some good large portion of the money is reserved for hiring technical talent for that institution as it comes up, because that's going to be, you can put a lot of nice buildings as there are around this great campus, but in the end it matters who's in there teaching those classes and the kind of people doing the research. So because that's what makes, and the peer learning that goes on, because it attracts more good people and it becomes a virtuous cycle. So Krishna is absolutely right, and I hope that that gets a lot of attention. And to some degree, I think China would be another good example to look at here, because they have done a good job with both Tsinghua and Shanghai and a whole bunch of Jietong and a whole bunch of these technical institutions. And since India cannot, have a broad approach to this, having a narrow approach and saying, look, the first place we're going to focus on higher education is around STEM is fine. That's a good place to start. So let's go get the best teachers in math, science, and the engineering faculties before you worry about the other areas, and that's okay. I think it would be accepted in Indian culture to do that.
There's a question at the back.
You said that even here in the Silicon Valley, where you have all of the necessary ingredients for a startup, you said that the gap between the idea and execution and success can be quite large. What would be the 2 or 3 key ingredients that would increase the odds of success that would also be true in India?
Meaning in the execution phase?
To go from a good idea, if you have all of the necessary ingredients, like funding and education, that increase the odds of going from a great idea to ultimately success.
Well, so the things that I look for when I fund first, and then I'll answer the question specifically, is I look at the team first, the quality of the team, because if I have a good team, they can overcome a bad space, because we can then morph into something else. The company can, in fact, InMobi was originally started as a mobile search company. I said, there is no business for you to be in mobile search. There's only one search company, and it's called Google. So they quickly got out of that space because they were smart guys and they knew how to morph into a different space. So team, and then the ability to think quickly and then move quickly is usually something that you see in very good startups. Beyond that, the first thing in execution that comes up is the DNA of that early team, which is if you hire A players, they're going to go hire more A players to become that early 10, 15, 20 employee team. Because by nature, very smart, very capable people are not insecure. They'll hire people that are willing to challenge them. Bs will hire Cs, Cs will hire Ds. So, and eventually as a company grows, they do dilute the talent pool because nobody can keep it very high quality forever, which is why as companies get very large, big is the enemy of innovation. Big is the enemy of further success. Although it hasn't been true in the case of somebody like Google, because they've continued to hire really, really smart people for a very long time. But generally, that has been the issue. I mean, even Microsoft is the other example that comes up that has stayed strong for a very long time because they've hired really good people. But lately, eventually those things become a barrier because new young talent doesn't want to go work in a big company. So the thing I would say is the quality of that early team, and then making the right choices, which is, there will be many forks in the road, and that young team of 20 or 30 people as they're building will have to make choices big and small. The problem is every decision when they're small is a big decision. So having the judgment without all the facts present, because not all wherever possible, you should let the data make the decisions rather than anybody's anecdotes or human instincts, because the data doesn't lie, so it's easier to make good decisions with data. And today, data is widely available, so you can almost run an algorithm-based model to make most decisions. But when the data is not present, making the good judgment decisions. So you get an offer to sell the company when you're 30 people for $100 million. Do you sell or do you keep building? So, and that's an important call for a young company to make. And those calls require judgment, not just analytics. Another example, do I hire this VP of engineering or do I hire somebody else? So if you make a bad decision there, you essentially pollute the team, because to unwind a bad decision is expensive in a young company. So those are some examples. The other is the middle management layer. The skill sets that they bring, the fact that they can execute well, to make sure that there's a process inside the company where everybody has their ABC, their 1, 2, 3 goals, and everyone is marching to the same song sheet. I think those things become important in a young company. And to the extent that that execution is clean and it's done in a way in which there's very few hiccups along the way, that sort of sets the foundation for the next level of success. So that, I think, is not easy to do, but it's one that the companies that do cross that sort of early sound barrier end up becoming much bigger companies.
We'll take a last question.
Okay, thank you. I'm from China. I want to ask a question about China and India. Recently, I read a book. The name is The Competition Between Elephant and Dragon. Of course, elephant stands for India, dragon stands for China. This book thinks that the competition between these two countries is much more than cooperation. What's your opinion about this problem? Thank you.
Well, having been in China a few times in the last several years, and also, of course, visiting India often, I would say they're on different tracks today. Eventually, there will be competition. I think China's issue in the long term will be the issue of population control, which will create in 20 to 25 years an aging population, perhaps not as severe as what Japan faces today, but perhaps in time it will become a big issue if they don't open up the one child policy and allow people to have more children. So that, I think, will be the #1 issue, unless, of course, there are issues around the model itself, which is sort of a state capitalism model where it's all state control and that's how it works. But yet private enterprise is allowed to flourish with state control. I'm not being very specific, but I think people get what I mean. So I think that model, if it's not challenged, will let China go for another 30 years. But the population issue will become the big issue if this one-child policy continues, say, beyond the next 10 years.
I had a last question, and the question was actually about what makes Stanford such an outstanding university, and what lesson do you have to give to other institutes of higher education. But I've actually found the answer to the question, so I'm not going to ask you, and we can end early. The answer, of course, is it lies with the excellence of our board of trustees and the members of our board of trustees.
I wish that was true, but it's not. Thank you.